Okay, so welcome. We are here at the Transit-Oriented Development Framework Study, public meeting number 2. The last meeting was in June with the Chief Garry Park neighborhood, and it should be about an hour meeting, 4:30 to 5:30. And today we're here to present some concepts that were developed through the first 2 phases of the study and to seek input and feedback on those development concepts, to kind of gauge the temperature, see if this is on the right track. And a few meeting norms. We just ask that while you're here, you be present with us and use respectful language towards each other and the presenters. Again, just to note that this is being recorded. But as we go, the chat box is available. I'll be monitoring that. And there will be pauses in the presentation where we'll do some live polls, and that's a good opportunity to ask questions in person too. So introductions wise, Jason Graff here is the project manager and lead consultant on this study. He's with Center-Based Planning and Urban Design out of Portland, Oregon, and he'll be leading us through the presentation tonight. Also here is Mike Tressiter from Spokane Transit Authority and Brandon Rapez-Betty from Spokane Transit Authority. So if there are questions specific to the city line or SDA, Mike or Brandon can answer those. So we'll get started. I'll bring up Jason's presentation here, and you can take it away, Jason, while I bring that up.
Great. Thanks, Colin.
Let's see. Full screen mode. Okay. Does that look all right?
That looks great. So as Colin mentioned, we're at phase 2 of what's called a transit-oriented development study, primarily for the City Line, which is a bus rapid transit line being constructed in downtown Spokane. Let's go to the next slide. TOD, if you're not familiar, it's land use and transportation that's integrated together with a transit route at its core. And that typically includes a mix of housing, commercial businesses, jobs, and services concentrated along walkable and bikeable streets within a quarter mile of that transit route. Next slide. Why TOD in Spokane? It's interesting. Transit-oriented development really meets market demands for mixed use, walkable development in urban areas. And in Spokane in particular, it's relevant to the city's growth strategy for investment along what are called high frequency transit corridors. Next slide. Our study purpose then is to identify an approach for transit supportive regulatory changes and priority infrastructure investments, things like walk and bike improvements that support these high frequency transit corridors. Next slide. And those include the City Line, which you see here in blue under construction, as well as a line along Division, Monroe Regal, and Sprague. And in conjunction with supporting transit-oriented development along these high-frequency transit corridors, next slide, we're also interested in implementing the city's comprehensive plan, which has looked for particular areas for infill and redevelopment. Much of these sites, called centers and corridors, align with the high-frequency transit routes. So we've got a bit of a dual purpose here. Next slide. As I mentioned, the City Line is the project that we're studying. That's our initial test site, so to speak. That alignment is 6 miles long, beginning on the west at Browns Addition, moving through downtown, north up through the University District and Logan neighborhood, and then continuing east through Chief Garry to its terminus at Spokane Community College. And that's going to include 28 stations within these 5 districts. Next slide. The City Line is a $92 million investment in the corridor, and its core is creating premium transit service, starting with first a comfortable and low packed electric vehicle, so lower noise, less emissions. The line will run frequently throughout the day. Peak time, 7.5 minutes. A bus will be arriving, up to about 15 minutes between buses later on in the day. So reliable and frequent And the SDA is then constructing a number of high quality stations, which we often call platforms, that allow for level boarding of the bus. There'll be covered shelters. There'll be ticketing that you can purchase at the station. They'll be well lit, and they'll include things such as reader boards, so you know when the next bus is coming. That $92 million investment is really intended to, what the next slide shows, is promote increased value along the corridor. The estimate is $175 million. For our work, we want to look at a particular section of City Line to look at what the opportunities are for transit-oriented development to help leverage that growth strategy, not only in the investment in infrastructure for the bus, but how we can promote future development that uniquely serves a number of districts within our study area. So that includes the Cincinnati Street corridor and the Mission Avenue corridor, and then those stations that run along that between the river and Spokane Community College. Next slide. The work that we're doing to get to regulations really needs to be preceded by an understanding of the context along the corridor and creating what we call station area planning framework. And that's guided by 3 principles. So these are 3 elements that we're really focused on when we're looking at access to stations and what future development might be in the context of any given station area. And the first is we want to establish a multimodal transportation corridor so that we're linking station to station with continuous biking and walking facilities. Next slide. We want to look to increase potential ridership through development and activity that support an active station environment, as well as walking and biking improvements that provide direct access between transit and the destinations that people wish to go to at each of the station areas. Next slide. And then finally, we want to enable the station areas to achieve their development potential by supporting transit-oriented infill or redevelopment properties for people to live and businesses to thrive near transit. Next slide. Our work then looks to define each of these districts, the University District, Logan Neighborhood, and Chief Garry, to identify their basic characteristics, the major destinations, and where opportunities for TOD might exist. Next slide. Our first station at the McCarthy Athletic Center along Cincinnati Avenue. This is primarily the University District, the west side of Cincinnati, being completely encompassed by Gonzaga University, housing, athletic facilities, and on the east side of Cincinnati and primarily along the Hamilton Street corridor, we have a mix of aging manufacturing and warehouse, some employment uses, and then Trent Avenue is really establishing itself as kind of an office and health peninsula corridor along that stretch of roadway. The TOD opportunities tend to be within areas of aging manufacturing and warehouse sites, vacant underutilized sites, and large parking lots. The Centennial Trail is another key feature running through this station area. Next slide. As we progress north to Des Moines, this really begins our transition between what's core Gonzaga University and some commercial uses on Hamilton into the Logan neighborhood. And the Hamilton corridor really is sort of the nexus and spine of the station area between the Des Moines and Columbia Street stations. The major destinations along Hamilton, of course, from a rider perspective, is the Safeway grocery store. As we move east along Mission Avenue, Mission Park is a major destination. We have a major employer with a Vista, and of course the Aquatic Center. So there are a number of destinations, both university, shopping, recreation, and employment within this corridor. Primarily the TOD opportunities are oriented along Hamilton Street. Next slide. As we transition further east along Mission Avenue, we cross the Spokane River, we come into the Chief Garry neighborhood, which is predominantly single-family housing. There are pockets of riverfront apartments, multifamily along the Spokane River. There are auto-oriented commercial industrial uses, primarily concentrated around Napa and Regal Street. And clearly one of the primary destinations is Spokane Community College at the terminus of the alignment, but there's also a number of destinations that include the Stevens School and Chief Gary Park. The Trans-Northern development opportunities tend to be along Mission Avenue at the station locations at Napa and Regal, where you have aging commercial, manufacturing, vacant, and underutilized sites. So next slide. Our first framework element that we want to address, having understood the basic context, is establishing what we call station area access routes. And they'll address the need for station to station and station to destination access improvements. We'll look to fill gaps and propose new routes that complete the city's adopted pedestrian and bike plan networks, and will inform potential future infrastructure improvements that support transit access. Next slide. We did an initial review and assessment of each of the station areas, and we looked at where destinations existed, what were barriers to transit, what were barriers to potential transit-oriented development sites, where are areas that lacked basic walk facilities or bicycle facilities. And that assessment sort of led us to these primary bullets. The first, we need to address Mission, Green, and Hamilton due to the high level of traffic speeds and the need to improve safe crossings along those three roadways. Mission in particular lacks any bicycle facilities, as does Napa, and Napa really does serve as a north-south connector within the Chief Gary neighborhood. But there are some really robust and great facilities on Sharp Avenue and Perry that just need to be extended to complete those networks. And then there are gaps in the Riverfront Trail, primarily south of Mission Avenue on the east side of the river. And through our analysis, we were able to determine areas where there are auto, pedestrian, and bike conflicts, where there's been accidents. For instance, there's been locations where safe routes to schools could be improved because maybe there's a lack of sidewalks. And so we want to look to create these station access routes that really can address all of these topics. Next slide. The first hierarchy of routes is the BRT corridor route, and that is then trying to promote a continuous walking biking facility that connects station to station along the corridor. Next slide. The next is the station access routes, which are really those primary streets that are for walking and biking that connect directly to the station from station area neighborhoods and public facilities. They tend to run perpendicular to the BRT corridor route. The next slide. Collector trails represent those access routes sort of outside in the outer edges of the station area. These are a part of your citywide and regional trail system, but they interconnect and in some instances intersect with the BRT corridor or other key routes that connect neighbors to destinations. So that's a part of the system. Next slide. And then finally, neighborhood access routes are more concerned about how do we link neighborhoods to destinations within the neighborhood. So where it intersects with routes that feed to the station, that's also important, but we're also looking for connections that link schools to parks, for instance, that may run, for instance, parallel to the BRT corridor. And that establishes the framework then for what we're calling station area access within this study area and approximately about a half mile from the stations. And so I'll pause here for us to answer any questions, but more importantly, have you all look at a survey question we have around station access routes.
Okay, I have a poll here. And it's live, so feel free to answer a couple questions here. Just want initial thoughts and reactions to this network. Okay, it looks like everyone who started the poll has finished the poll. So I'll close it and we can share the results. And on your screen, you can toggle the window to see the results a little bit easier to see the full question. And it looks like everyone answered well or very well for how well do these proposed improvements respond to the goals. And then as far as how well they respond to supporting transit-oriented development and transit ridership, I was 1 response adequate, 1 well, and 2 very well, or 3 very well. So it's helpful, good feedback, and these will be on the survey on the project website. So I'll close that and take it away, Jason.
Great. Let's move on to the next slide. This is going better than expected. The next piece of the framework is really looking at land use and the transit-oriented development potential. And so typically what's done is for not all stations are the same, not all development opportunities in the station areas are similar, and you tend to have varying degrees of intensity of development, for instance, and certain types of development. And so typologies help us support those neighborhoods that we've defined and their district character and function, as well as inform the type and intensity of development and station access for those stations and station areas. And that thirdly, that we respond to the local growth policies and plans, such as ped and bike plans and the comprehensive plan. So we're looking at all 3 of those then together as we establish these typologies for development. Next slide. The first typology is what we call a center station, and this is typified by what would be the highest density of development. So apartments, condominiums, and townhomes, looking to integrate that with single-use or mixed-use buildings that include commercial that are street-oriented. Largely, this type of development is at a district scale, larger scale, quite often includes employment, some public amenities, and of course, safe and direct and convenient walk and bike access between the stations and development within that station area. Next slide. The corridor is another piece that tends to be that linear connection, i.e. Hamilton Street, for instance, or we're talking Division Street. I think you all understand that physical form of being a corridor. What we tend to see in a corridor type station is that development tends to be pretty close to the alignment itself. So you get a mix of land use extending, approximately 2 blocks from the primary transit route. And it includes a variety and range of medium and opportunities for high density apartments, condominiums, townhomes, but also looking for street-oriented retail and commercial, and of course, safe and direct access to transit. Tends to be linear, tends to not extend too far from the transit corridor. Next slide. Certainly along the city line, we do have Spokane Community College, Gonzaga University, we have the Avista headquarters. These tend to be large areas that are master planned, usually by a university or a major employer, and largely decisions about land use and to some degree circulation are dictated by a master plan. And it tends to be highly coordinated between the city and those large property owners. Next slide. As we kind of ratchet down the scale from a center or corridor, we do see in Spokane these little unique, what we call neighborhood nodes, where you have the opportunity to create what we call neighborhood compatible apartments and condominiums and townhomes. So adding multifamily to what typically are single family neighborhoods, but along certain corridors, you see these nodes that provide then some street oriented retail, commercial, neighborhood serving uses. Quite often there's schools or parks located in this type of typology. And again, we're promoting access to transit to those destinations within the scale of a neighborhood node. Next slide. and portions of a BRT alignment can have stations that are predominantly surrounded by existing single-family residential, where opportunities for development are fairly limited, but there may be, for instance, opportunities to do infill housing. These areas tend to be close to neighborhood parks, sometimes schools, and again, the walk and bike access is critical to link those residents, the destinations, and the stations. So that encompasses really 5 typologies that we've identified along the city line corridor in our study area. Next slide.
If we could pause for 1 second, we had a question in the chat from Colleen about what the time frame is for action on these things. I think it was in reference to the station area access network, but also all these things. So I can address that a little bit. And I should have introduced everyone from the city as well who's on the meeting. Tyrell Black, principal planner in the planning services department, is on the line, and Amanda Beck as well, assistant planner. So, but I would say, overall, some of the policy and regulation changes would be the first things to be the outcomes of this study. So comp plan amendments and that type of thing, and potentially zoning changes, but that would be a follow-up to this study. As far as infrastructure improvements, things that are already in our master plans would be quicker. They could be done as streets are resurfaced, and that's what we do as part of the plan. So things that are already part of the plan could be done more quickly, but things that are new and that need a little bit more vetting from all the city departments would be a little further out to get those into the plan and then acted upon. So I hope that helps answer your question a little bit, Colleen. Does that get at it?
Well, yeah, kind of. I guess I don't want to be disrespectful or unappreciative for all the effort that goes into this, but it just seems to me that frequently we do all these studies and we do all these surveys and we do all this input, and for the most part, we don't see an awful lot of action until most of us are not involved anymore, or who's ever involved at Jason's level changes, or who's ever involved in planning changes, and then it all goes back to square one. So I'm not trying to belittle or to demean the work that's been done, because the work that's been done is fantastic. But as many of you know, I've been involved a long time, and I get really, really tired of hearing about all these glorious plans and looking at all these wonderful hours of time that's spent putting this together, and then it all seems to go in a drawer someplace and we never hear about it again. So it's just frustration on my part as to how we implement, particularly when you're talking about a neighborhood. So, it's just hard for me to be patient enough at age 75 to look to the future to say, well, is any of this going to actually happen in my lifetime? So it's just frustration on my part with, I guess, the impatience on my part with the process of how long the process takes. So it's just an old lady crabbing.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you. Yeah, fair points.
So let's move on to the next slide. Those typologies have then been arrayed along the city line alignment. And so now that we have kind of a basic understanding about the districts, we understand some of the impediments to access. It's time now to really look at where the opportunities for transit-oriented development might occur. And so that's the next piece of the framework. Next slide. And transit-oriented development tends to follow this pattern. We're looking for infill sites, so opportunities that include vacant and underutilized, or for instance, large parking sites where there's multiple properties with a single owner. That, I think, to Colleen's point, is where we see change potentially happen sooner rather than later if there's interest and motivation. The other is that we have to be cognizant of the station area assets and barriers to transit-oriented development. And that could be a lack of interest in redevelopment. That could be the design of streets and access improvements that are really making it difficult for pedestrian-oriented type of development to succeed. And I think on the upside of that is we can also look in neighborhoods and identify where there's certain types of development that haven't occurred today that might actually be ideally suited for transit-oriented development and may have an additional benefit to the neighborhood by providing housing choice, for instance, by providing commercial services and possibly a small amount of employment close to residents in the existing neighborhood, and maybe opportunities to improve public facilities such as parks and access to schools. So let's go to the next slide. In our initial review and analysis, then we looked at these factors. Do stations have transit supported development today that we can build off of, or are they lacking? In certain station areas, what are the gaps in development? Is it a lack of multifamily, or is it a lack of employment, or is it a lack of commercial and retail uses within a given station area? We also looked at the city's analysis on displacement risk and knowing areas that tend to be more susceptible to displacement with redevelopment than other areas. And then finally, on the ground, physically looking at those vacant, underutilized, and potential redevelopment areas and mapping those within each of the station areas. And so 3 stations really surfaced as potential areas to look at development scenarios. So transit-oriented development scenarios at 3 station locations: at the McCarthy Athletic Center, at the Napa station, and at the Regal station. The Athletic Center station, obviously, that's on Cincinnati, down near the river. Napa, of course, at Mission and Napa, and Regal at Regal and Mission. And here's what we found. Those 3 sites, prevalence of vacant, underutilized, and potential redevelopment areas, they all have good access and visibility for major transportation routes, which means we're not relying on future people living in the neighborhood to support different uses. There's typically infrastructure in place today to help support redevelopment. That also includes an adequate resident population that's there today, or employee populations and amenities that are likely to support redevelopment. So next slide. We're going to start first with the McCarthy Athletic Center, and it's been designated in the comprehensive plan as what's called a center, and that tends to be higher density mixed use development associated with this corridor along Hamilton, for instance. The desire of the comprehensive plan is to stimulate pedestrian activity with mutually reinforcing land uses. And as a part of this study, we want to add the layer of integrating development and transit with improved walk and bike access along key routes. So let's take a look at what a transit-oriented development scenario might be for the McCarthy Athletic Center. Next slide. Looking at the station assets, there's some basic fundamentals that support redevelopment in this district. The first is the drive-by traffic, high visibility along the Hamilton Street, Trent Avenue corridors. There's great access to downtown, great access to I-90. You generally have some built-in population to support housing, to support commercial development, to support dining, for instance, that really includes the Gonzaga University resident and staff population. There's some employment uses nearby. The opportunities for redevelopment may exist on those aging uses on large sites and predominantly single ownership parcels. And this district is really amenity rich with the extensive river frontage and the trail network that you can see here on the dotted lines that are circumventing most of the district. So it's a real unique opportunity, I think, in the city of Spokane. So let's look at the next slide. The barriers, as much as Hamilton and Trent Avenue are assets, when it comes to stimulating pedestrian activity and supporting bike access, Hamilton and Trent, because of the excessive traffic volumes, primarily on Hamilton, less so on Trent, it is very difficult to have development really want to pony up against those streets. And so what we're seeing in terms of development trend along Hamilton is there's a lot of buildings with inactive frontages. When new development comes online, it tends to push itself away from, not engage Hamilton Street. And so I think it's important that we look for other streets in the district as a potentially spark for new development over time. We do need to improve the trail networks. If we can complete a complete trail frontage around this district, I think that would help a lot. So that's a barrier to fill that incomplete trail network. And then the other piece is, how do we get through this hump of limited direct river access so that we can utilize the Spokane riverfront as really an activity center that promotes development in the district, not just for people who live there, but also people who work and visit the area as well. So let's go to the next slide. The TOD opportunity sites, again, we've mapped, those are outlined in yellow here, predominantly along Hamilton Street, but also Columbus and along the riverfront. And what we're seeing is that development is beginning to assert itself along the edges. To the north, there's some additional multifamily housing that's coming online, the Planned Health and Education Research Building at Trent, and then to the south, a large multifamily project is occurring on the south side of the river. And that gives us some indication of the direction development is going to and what we might be able to test over time. Next slide. If we think about development trends and we look at where some of these sites are transitioning, the Philomena, for instance, is a new apartment project that's happening on the north side of the district. And that's really linked to an existing project, the Matilda. So that was commercial and multifamily. And of course, we have, the core of Gonzaga University resident halls. So we have this emerging housing district on the north side. As I mentioned before, on the south side, the Riverbend apartment project is bringing along approximately 260 new apartments on the south side of the river. And then Trent Avenue is becoming this employment corridor where today on the west side you have WSU and their facilities, the new health and education research building that's going online at Trent and Hamilton, and then your existing office development that you have along Trent Avenue on the east side of the Spokane River. And I think one of the other interesting nuggets of what exists in the district today is what I'd call a dining and beverage destination with the Riverwalk project, where you have a brewery and some offices and a range of uses, but you have a great old existing historic structure to really build from. Next slide. What I think is critical to help kickstart redevelopment and in particular pedestrian-oriented and transit-oriented development is to define what we would call a hub or create what's called a street-oriented destination. The typical right retail configuration is a 1/4 mile in length, and Springfield Avenue really potentially provides a location to do that, where you could assemble edge-to-edge retail, commercial, and service uses along that 3-block stretch that's frankly anchored on the west by Gonzaga University and the riverfront on the east. And so what we're looking to then with a hub is to create a low traffic street that can accommodate high quality pedestrian bike destination, again, those edge-to-edge storefronts. And we may need to look at a district parking site to help serve some of those commercial uses. So maybe carve out a block where we can basically park the vehicles and allow for the rest of the development to occur on multiple sites in the district. Next slide. What that street might be, we're calling an active street. I think that one of the closest examples to what this Springfield Avenue might be is to look at Kendall Yards and how they were able to assemble a couple of blocks with commercial services, retail and dining on both sides of the street in a very walkable environment. They've got a park and plaza at one end, and I think that's a model that could potentially be replicated here. In terms of regulatory, we're informed really by ensuring that from the regulatory side out of this process that we're defining design guidelines and standards that ensure a high quality and active pedestrian environment. So that'll be a part of our work too in terms of recommendations down the road. Next slide. For retail to be successful, they need what are called anchors. Anchors are those uses that bring a lot of people into the area, and grocery stores tend to be the number one anchor when it comes to creating a hub or street-oriented destination. And we know some basic facts about grocery store. They typically add 30% yearly additional sales for the adjacent inline shops. And in this area, looking at the TOD potential sites, you know, there's clearly room potentially for a 20 to 40,000 square foot full service grocery between Hamilton, for instance, and Columbus. It may be able to incorporate, for instance, local models, Yolks, Rose Hours, or Fresh Basket. And where I have that arrow pointed is really an ideal location from the grocer's perspective, because you've got great access and visibility along Hamilton and Trent, as well as the ability to siphon in that what's called the PM commute, those people leaving work then to pull into the grocery store. So Safeway has followed that same model a half mile or so up the road. Next slide. This is a project in St. Paul, Minnesota, and this is north of downtown, where they've integrated grocery store with multifamily housing. So apartments above, grocery store on the ground floor, and you can see all built to the sidewalk. Great windows and door openings, and it's definitely an anchor for the additional commercial, retail, and dining establishments on either side of this project. Next slide. The next piece is to look at the Riverwalk as an additional anchor along the east side of Springfield Avenue. And this may be a great location to expand on what's already happening with the brewery, to really showcase local brewers, chefs, local cuisine. Think about local boutiques who can fit in sort of a larger space area, still maintain some co-working and flex office because you have a number of buildings connected together. And I think another addition that Riverwalk needs to consider is how they can introduce more outdoor gathering on both sides of the building. In a concept of this type, there is a local example called the North Bank Wonder Building. So let's go to the next slide. And this just gives you a visual representation of, again, this is oddly enough another project in St. Paul. This is the Schlitz Brewery, where they've reconditioned one of the older brick buildings into what's called the Keg and Case. And again, this is a showcase for local chefs, local businesses, and they're engaging the building with outdoor dining and spaces all the way around it. So next slide. The other piece then is to how do we bring the waterfront into the district as well? How can that be a unique attraction with river access that extends the amount of time and period spent in the district? And so those purple dots represent strategically located sort of public access and non-motorized, for instance, watercraft landings. And of course, we want to also complete the riverfront trail so that it's going completely around, so under Trent Avenue and under the bridge crossing at Spokane, adjacent to Hamilton Street. Next slide. And this illustrates the brewery today is already engaging the riverfront. And so again, could these landings really extend from that place, and are there other opportunities then to create these conditions? The image on the lower right is actually what you've already built underneath the Division Street viaduct. So I think there's local examples that translate really well to a variety of locations along the waterfront here at the McCarthy Athletic Center station. Next slide. And there's also that triangular property just south of Trent Avenue and just east of the major crossing of the Spokane River that may become a formalized riverfront park or beach. I mean, what an amenity to add to an area that's wholly underutilized today. And let's go to the next slide, because I think visuals are much better than words. This is an example of a project north of downtown Denver, where they've done just that and taken an area that on two sides is surrounded by fairly busy roadways, but they've been able to create a public park, access to the river, outdoor gathering, and of course trails then are intermingled through that space, connecting the park to the neighborhoods, both north, south, east, and west of this area. So next slide. These amenities really do help attract high quality development, and that leads into this next slide, which is where are opportunities potentially for creating not just multifamily buildings plopped on blocks, but an actual housing district, what most people would just call a neighborhood, where you have a range of multi-story apartments, condominiums, and townhomes. We can address affordability, market rate, mixed income projects that are likely to be higher intensity, taller buildings, may need some type of structured parking or podium. The amenities then, parks and park blocks and trails, are critical for this type of development to flourish and for these sites to become, major housing redevelopment sites to create a district. So let's go to the next slide. What do those park amenities do? They create a variety of different spaces for this higher intensity development to pony up against, creating passive green spaces, creating spaces for kids to play. So it's a family neighborhood as much as it's a single and young professional neighborhood, and that there's areas then for public gathering in those park blocks. Next slide. And I think I'm wearing this out, but here's the last element, and I think it's the warehouse provides an interesting sports and fitness amenity. What people living in urban housing are sometimes obsessed about fitness, and it's what a great asset to have literally in the core of the district. Next slide. And maybe there's an opportunity to expand the function of that facility to include, additional workout rooms, whether it's, a variety of different fitness that folks are looking for. Maybe consider a vertical climbing wall that could engage the Centennial Trail overpass. And so I think as an asset, it's a great one. And if it could be expanded on, even better, really, to support a robust and vibrant neighborhood. Next slide. And then finally, the Health Peninsula Employment Cluster at Trent Avenue, I think, is a bit of a no-brainer with the health and research facility being built next to McKinstry. Those two sites then on the north side of Trent and on either side of Hamilton become, I think, extremely desirable for high-tech education, co-work, and research type facilities. Next slide. An example of that is the Cortex in St. Louis, where they've done just that. Light rail transit, a large medical center that has spawned a bunch of research facilities, all in proximity to the LRT station and the existing hospital. The image on the upper right here, of course, is the health and research building that's underway locally. So that just gives you an example and flavor of what's happened in other places. Next slide.
Okay.
And then if you'll go back one more slide, then let's go to your survey, if that's okay.
Yeah, I have another survey about two of the project principles or guidelines, live and work. How well does this development concept support enabling live and work near transit? And the second question is about how well does this support transit ridership? So I'll open the poll here. And I'll just leave it open for a minute here. Seemed like the last one went pretty quick. And feel free to ask questions as we're filling this out if we can clarify anything that was presented. Okay, so we'll share the results here. It looks like it's pretty well spread across adequate to very well in terms of how these development concepts accomplish the goals. In terms of supporting live and work near transit, there were 4 responses for well or very well, 5 for very well, and then 3 for well or very well for transit access. So I'll close that and we can move on.
I realize we're pressed for time here, and I'll try to speed it up a little bit. So next slide. We're there, Napa Street Station. The barrier is obviously Mission Avenue. We've had conflicts with auto, ped, and bike along that roadway. Heavy amount of traffic. There's some TOD opportunity sites. Development largely tends to be sort of auto-oriented. There's a lack of, there's poor pedestrian environment in that there's narrow sidewalks and no buffer for folks walking up and down Mission Avenue. And of course, the trail network, completing that to the south would be a benefit. But today there is no trail access south of Mission Avenue along Spokane River. Next slide. I think to address initially the access issues along Mission Avenue, this is one proposal, and this is a way to address the guidelines for the project, which is to try and create a continuous walk and bike facility that connects station to station, and to address, walk and bike deficiencies, in particular around Mission Avenue. So looking for enhancements to some crossings, so improving those connections across Mission Avenue are important. One concept and a way of doing that, and at the same time promote TOD, because we're trying to create some commercial development that serves the neighborhood, and that really needs on-street parking to survive. So a thought about changing Mission Avenue would be to convert what's a 4-lane roadway today to 3 lanes. That would allow for walk and bike facilities to then, or bike facilities potentially to take over one of those lanes, let's say on the south side of the street. That could extend to the bridge crossing over to the Aquatic Center and Mission Park. So now we can get both walking and biking across that bridge, and the bikes then can continue down Mission Avenue, running both directions side by side within that lane on the south side of the street. There's some key intersections and crossing improvements that I think are critical to study over time. One is near the west side of, the east side of the bridge at the Spokane River, and then at Napa Street, to ensure that we've got good, safe access across that roadway to connect to transit, but also to connect to the riverfront trail. And then by utilizing some setbacks on existing properties, maybe be able to add on-street parking, which would really serve commercial development. So this is just an idea of how we can stimulate TOD and improve access along Mission Avenue, at the same time serve the BRT. Next slide. The assets then, in terms of commercial development, are the drive-by traffic and access that Mission Avenue and Napa both afford. And the neighborhood is fairly amenity rich, especially from a family neighborhood perspective, because you've got schools, parks, and the riverfront trail. And directly at the station, there are aging, vacant, and underutilized parcels. So next slide. Those TOD opportunity sites are then illustrated here in yellow. What we're seeing is that planned infill of townhomes, for instance, is happening near Stevens. Multifamily apartments have already been constructed along the waterfront, so we know there's a potential market for that. There's a number of sites in and around single-family homes that may be potential sites for a duplex or triplex, so adding a little additional housing options in the neighborhood. Those might be some locations for that. And then the planned family services facility is being built out at the Promise building that you see there in the arrow. So planned family services is in the old grocery store. Next slide. Looking at those trends, I think it's obvious that on the top right side of the image here, that we might see multifamily apartments built, similar to what you're seeing along the waterfront. And ideally, we'd want to incorporate some ground floor commercial along Mission Avenue. The service center building to the left is probably in need of some redevelopment, but likely a great candidate for bringing in new tenants and adding some commercial uses that aren't there today. And then, of course, Family Promise, they're providing shelter services, but maybe over time they purchase the house just to the south or just to the east of them, that they might institute then an affordable housing project. So transitioning from shelter to more permanent housing may be an opportunity for them to expand their services and at the same time create some commercial adjacent directly to the Napa Street station on the east side of Napa. Next slide. As development happens and is constructed, you tend to see down the road establishing more of a market here, which means possibly behind the Family Promise building, you might see market rate apartments built, for instance. Maybe that's a 3-story project. And certainly the Highs mini market then, with initial investment over time, just kind of setting the stage for mixed use development on that property as well. Next slide. And I think you would likely then see round out of additional projects then come online. If those initial projects were successful, the auto repair building, for instance, and then maybe conversion of the single family homes that are zoned commercial or neighborhood retail today could maybe convert to townhomes, some other type of use. Next slide.
We have
So
one more.
our survey is ready to discuss the Napa Street then TOD potential.
And it's the same principles or goals that are being asked. How well does that concept support living and working near transit? And how well does it support transit ridership? And Colleen had a question about how these changes are funded as the poll gets filled out here. It's like you pointed out, Colleen, getting developers involved, but creating the policy and regulation framework where it makes sense for them to get involved it will be the primary outcome of this study that we'll follow up on, is making those policy and regulatory changes. And then as far as the public infrastructure goes, that would be similar to other bikeway, trail, or street improvements. Close the poll there, share the results. It looks like similar to the other questions, we're ending up mostly in the well or very well range for how these development concepts support those goals. So I'll turn it back to you, Jason.
Great. So let's go to the next slide and we'll just take a quick jaunt down to Regal Street. Really, the barriers that exist here are very similar to Napa. Mission Avenue is what it is. It is in need of at least some basic improvements that support walking and biking. There's a number of sites, even more so. So this is a bit of a little bit larger scale than what we saw in terms of development opportunity at Napa. In that, potentially we're looking at a block or two off of Mission Avenue, primarily on the south, but also the north side. There's a number of sites where TOD potential may be down the road, but certainly dealing with Mission Avenue and Green Street, some enhancements to intersection improvements are warranted, as well as potentially at the station. Next slide. So the Mission Avenue improvements that we discussed at Napa would then extend up past Chief Gary Park and into the TOD opportunity sites here at Regal. So again, it's that 3-lane section, a 2-way bikeway on the south side of Mission Avenue, and some enhanced intersection improvements, particularly at Regal to get to transit, but I think also at Green, because if this bike facility were to extend, which we would hope to promote, extending it further east to Southeast Community College, being able to get through the Green intersection is going to be extremely important from a safety perspective. And next slide. So the assets obviously are the drive-by traffic, which can support commercial development along Mission and Green. And there are a number of sites that we can then look at for a TOD development scenario. So let's go ahead and do that. There are some online projects that are similar to Napa and that are establishing trends for development. So one is the Plan VOA Homeless Teen Services Building, which will also include a health center built up to Mission Avenue. There's a planned young adult shelter remodel on the arrow that you see on the left side of the screen. And then just to the north of that, which is to the left of that, is a planned new apartment building. So we're actually seeing some apartment development interest here at the station area. And I don't think it's a surprise, being how close it is to Spokane Community College and with future transit coming online. So that's a bit of the trends that we're seeing. So let's look at the next slide. And how can we capitalize on that? And I think the first is really looking at some of these properties that have single ownership, that do have working businesses on a portion, but have some vacant and underutilized segments as well. And so there's really two properties that have surfaced. One is the Progressions Credit Union on the left side of your screen, directly at where the new westbound station would be going to downtown. And then across the street, where you have a construction company, they have a number of sort of storage areas and lower use areas that maybe they could carve out for redevelopment and still function as a business. And so what we're thinking is apartments with some ground floor commercial, really strategically located next to the VOA facility, but also at the stations. So next slide. And that may be a range of affordable and market rate. For instance, maybe townhomes on the left, affordable housing more in proximity of VOA. The Mission Village Commercial Center has a significant amount of land area behind the commercial development that might be adequate then for affordable or market rate housing. And then I think there are a number of, there's two vacant parcels there on the right where you see townhomes that might be great for a first phase townhome development directly adjacent to Chief Garry Park. Next slide. And as before, as developer interest were to come online, projects are built, you're going to see more development occur, which could be a second phase, for instance, of townhomes that really built out that entire block between Haven and Regal and Cento. And then that property owner, maybe with success of an initial project, may proceed and do an additional apartment with some commercial project adjacent to Chief Garry Park. Next slide. And then we just sort of domino to these additional sites for some more infill. Maybe it's commercial up at Green because you've got that great access and proximity to drive-by traffic, and maybe some additional housing infill on the sites that you see here. And so that's generally how you might see phased TOD development at the Regal Station. But you can see it's a substantial amount of area, and it takes advantage of Chief Garry Park, and it takes advantage of, you know, potential commercial development because of the drive-by traffic on Mission. And then I'll give it to you, Colin.
We're at the end here and we have one last poll, so I'll open it up. It's the same questions applied to this station area regarding how well does this support living and working near transit, and how well does it support ridership? And these same questions and a similar survey will be available online. It's live now, so you can share that with folks who maybe weren't able to attend or who might be interested in this type of thing. All right, looks like everyone who started the survey finished it. I'll share the results, and it's very consistent. It looks like we did get one ranking it poorly in terms of serving live and work near transit. So I think that's good to know. That's good feedback. And this is actually a good time if anyone wants to expand on their answers. If you have any other thoughts to expand on, now would be a good time, and then we'll wrap up the meeting.
This is Karen Bird. I put that because I know what this looks like now, and I think my bias there is looking at if I would want to live there. Just with what you've proposed, I don't know that makes it a real livable, workable location from just what you've proposed. I think it could get there, but I think it would need more help to get there.
Got it. You're not
What do you
seeing the mix.
Yeah, what do you think the weakness is in your mind?
Trees and green. I know you have Chief Garry Park.
Yeah, just too much development. Okay.
Traffic, the intense traffic, intense numbers of traffic, and the almost highway quality you have in a certain spot there. To me.
Sure.
That area.
Yeah, the environment is questionable, I would agree.
That's helpful feedback. So maybe more things like the park block amenities and those types of improvements that we talked about earlier.
Right.
Okay. know we're right at 5:30 here, but does anyone else want to expand on their thoughts or answers? And the chat's a great place to put that as well. All right, I'll hand it over to you again, Jason.
So there are next steps. We're a little over halfway done with the work, but we'll come back and take a final look at refining the typologies and station access routes based on what we've heard from the community and our technical advisory groups, and then come back with. The study is just coming back with recommendations, so none of these are proposed changes or asking the city to adopt capital improvement program around any of these street improvements, but to provide a little more definition, some direction on maybe priorities for some of these improvements. And then really the meat of what we're being asked to do is to establish this regulatory framework. So what can we apply to these station areas in terms of regulations that could potentially promote these type of development scenarios that we've seen? And so we're in the process now of coming up with some initial ideas for that. And then we'll bring those recommendations to staff. We're going to vet those with our technical group, and then we should come back to the community at some point to share what that regulatory approach would be as well. And in the end, we'll finalize a document which says these are the final recommendations and these are the next steps the city might pursue to address the regulatory changes and further studies.
Great. I will point folks to the website, and there was one more question in the chat from Karen. Since the centers and corridors concept was never fully implemented, how do you propose implementing these TOD opportunities in these areas like Springfield or street-oriented destinations? And I think that is really what this study is pointing us towards, is updating the centers and corridors concepts and the zoning associated with that. And that'll be part of the next phase, is really fleshing out those regulatory adjustments and changes. Do you want to speak to that at all, Jason?
No, I mean, I think you've covered it. But when we're talking about the McCarthy Athletic Center, I mean, based on what the city's done in previous work, you would expect a sub-area plan potentially then to provide more definition, bring on a lot more partners and engagement so that we can really vet what that, I mean, I showed one scenario and I think there's some positive attributes to that, but that has to be vetted with, I think, a larger group. And that may build, you would want that sub-area plan then to build a constituency that would help implement that station area in particular. But until you have those conversations and bring the partners together, both community, private development, and the city, it's really hard to forge a path forward. So there's a little bit of work that needs to be done over there in a good way.
Does that help answer your question, Karen?
Love all this work. I'm excited, and like Colleen, I want to see it happen. We did, the form-based code planning on some of Hamilton, and we kind of stayed away from that kind of industrial quote area, south, but that could be extended as well, because you mentioned, Jason, around development being away from the street, but it could, that work could continue like you talked about on that.
Exactly.
So thank you so much for all
Thank
your
you.
work on this. Love it. So excited for the City Line to be here. And
Cool.
Thank you so much for all your work on this. And I look forward to hearing more and being involved in more. Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely. More to come. And here's the survey that links from the site, and we will have a recording of this meeting on the website and available, and we'll keep you all posted. So thank you for your time tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you.